Hi, I'm Femi OK. You're in the stream. We are live on Jazeera and on YouTube. Today, is India an unsafe place for journalists? We'll discuss how the recent attacks on reporters are highlighting a growing trend of hostility towards the media. Two journalists killed in hit-and-run attacks. Another, seeking information from police, is instead beaten and thrown into jail. Several others assaulted while covering a protest, despite telling authorities they were journalists. And all of these incidents in just the month of March. Now, these attacks underscore the dangers many journalists in India face when trying to do their jobs. Joining us to discuss this in Aizawl, India, MEC Lorby. She's a journalist with News 18, and she was recently attacked by police while covering a border dispute. In New Delhi, Tridip Mandal, a journalist and senior creative director at The Quint, a digital news platform in India. Also in New Delhi, Aditi Tandon, a reporter at The Tribune and the General Secretary of the Indian Women's Press Corps. And in Paris, France, we have Daniel Bastar. He's the head of the Asia Pacific desk for Reporters Without Borders. Welcome, everybody. Good to have you in the stream. I wish it was about a better subject. Emmy, your story that you were reporting on earlier on this month resulted in you being severely injured. Can you tell us the original premise of the story? What were you going out to do?
Well, it was on March 10th, and I asked my editor that I want to do the story where there was an incident that involved a border dispute that involved the students, the Mizo students, and the Assam police were guarding the area. The Mizo students wanted to construct a rest shed in the border of Mizoram and Assam, which is actually a status quo. And on March 8th, some of my friends, the journalist friends, were already attacked while they were covering the story. The Assam police have just brutally attacked them, and they got injured. And later on, when the situation was a little bit calm, they went back and they confronted the Assam police. Why did you attack us? We were screaming at you. We were showing our press credentials, and you still attack us. And at that time, Assam police apologized to them, and they said it won't have ever happen again. No journalist will be attacked again. So the next day, on March 10th, I asked my editor, I want to do this story. I want to do a ground reporting of the story. So I got permission. I moved out early in the morning at around 6 a.m. and reached the camp, the area at around 11 a.m. So as soon as we reached there, the confrontation started between the students and the Assam police. They were in the forefront trying to take the footage, trying to film, and out of nowhere, the police started.
So, Emmy, I'm just going to stop you for a little while. I know the weather's bad where you are, so it's a little difficult to hear you. So, Emmy was covering this rally. She knew that there had been violence by the police before, and then she started to film what happened to her. I just want you to take 20 seconds and look at the video she shot as she was trying to escape the police. Tridip, as you're watching this, what goes through your mind? Were you expecting anything like this to happen to a journalist doing their job?
Are you asking me?
Yes, Tridip.
Yeah, when I saw the footage for the first time, when Emmy had posted it on social media, initially she had posted only the photographs of her injuries. I didn't really understand the gravity of the situation. And then after this, she put out the video of what had happened. So we are not part of the same organization, but I thought that it's my duty as a journalist to put out what was happening in one remote corner of India. So on the Quint, we took it upon ourselves so that we put out the video. We reached out to Emmy, and she put out a video, and we had a video of the attack on her, and we put it out on the Quint. What really surprised me at that point of time was very few other media outlets was covering this incident, and what had happened to Emmy was very serious.
Aditi, I'm just wondering, how common is this to happen in India? We were saying that there appears to be an uptick, certainly in the last couple of weeks. But how often is it that journalists themselves are being attacked?
Well, Femi, this is not a new phenomenon. That's what I want to emphasize to start with. The only thing that's new is, this extra attention that's being given to increasing crimes against journalists. And you and I know it's a worldwide phenomenon. It always suits governments to muzzle the press, be it India, be it anywhere. But I want to underscore one point about our country, and that is violence against journalists has been a routine. For instance, if you look at certain data that is available in public in India, the Press Council of India, which is the overarching regulator for the print industry in India, recently put out a report that said 80 journalists had been killed starting 1990 in India, and only in one case was the conviction secured. So you see the impunity towards crimes against journalists in the country is high. And the real problem is lack of law, a standalone law to protect the journalists, and then the lack of implementation of whatever little laws do exist in terms of protection of journalists. See, journalists are not a special category in India yet. Although I have been following a certain debate in the US, we know that one Democratic congressman has been pressing for an interesting piece of law called the Protection of Journalists Act. I'm sure you'll be aware of it. And the fact that Trump administration has been saying things like the press is a stain on the American people and things like
Aditi,
that.
are you bringing that up because you feel that what's happening in America is impacting what's happening in India, or is India a whole different situation?
No, well, the point that I'm trying to make, Femi, is that governments everywhere are going to muzzle the press. It's up to the press to stand united and fight for press freedom. And India does not have a national protection law for journalists. The one point that I want to bring in here is that there is a ray of hope that we see from a small, from a western state in the country, which is Maharashtra, which is currently governed by the ruling BJP and its ally, the Shiv Sena. They've put out the first ever law for the protection of journalists, and they call it the Maharashtra Protection of Media Persons Act. So the first time in the history of India, we have a federal state that has actually said that assaulting a journalist will be considered a crime. And so will be damage of property of a journalist if he's injured or his equipment is taken away. Is taken away in the course of news gathering. So you see, there is a ray of hope somewhere along the horizon. And we at the Indian Women's Press Corps and a lot of other media organizations in India will try and engage the government of the country to come out with a national model act for protection of journalists. And then every state can actually adopt one such law, because after all, journalists being increasingly targeted have to now have special protection.
Okay,
Femi,
Aditi, let me just bring in Daniel. He's in the conversation too, as is Tradip, and we haven't quite lost Emily yet. So I want to bring her back in the conversation. Daniel, I'm looking here. RSF Inter, Reporters Without Borders, tweeting out surge in police violence against journalists in India. What are the stats? What are you looking at? How bad has it become?
Well, as a head of Asia Pacific desk at Reporters Without Borders, I try to monitor every violation of press freedom across the region. And the month of March started with one first police attack on journalists. This was one photographer in the streets of New Delhi who was trying to cover the closure of a market. Then there was what happened to Emmy and her fellow journalists in northeastern India. And then 2 weeks after, there was this violent police action against journalists in Delhi. And 1 day after, there was one journalist who had been beaten by police in the southern state of Kerala. So that's 4 cases, and at least maybe 12 or 13 journalists who've been beaten by the police in the time of 1 month. And that's only what I've managed to monitor. and I cannot monitor what always happens in rural India, which is much more difficult to document. So there is, as Aditi said, there is a very a worrying trend, and it's all the more true that the context is very sensitive.
What do you mean by that, Daniel? Context is very sensitive. What does that mean?
24 hours.
Tridip, this is coming live on YouTube. Nikhilesh says, Indian government under PM Modi doesn't like independent media. It wants to muzzle freedom and spread fake news through its mouthpiece news channels. Harsh, partisan, fair?
I think PM Modi did send out the right signal yesterday when his office passed an order nullifying an earlier order passed by the Information and Broadcasting Ministry, where they had tried to sort of punish journalists if they were in any way involved in publication or distribution of fake news, you know. So the Information and Broadcasting Ministry had put out that their accreditation would be cancelled, but the Prime Minister stepped in at the right time, and he has sort of nullified the order passed by the INB Ministry. So the Prime Minister has sent out the right signal. But the invisible hand, which sort of you don't see the pressure very obviously and very openly, but there's definitely an invisible hand where people are a little cautious when they are out there to criticize policies and programs of the government, or particularly television channels. Print media is still okay, but particularly television channels across India, they are looking more and more partisan to the party in power.
I'm wondering if you can unpack this for us, Gas, and explain the reason why. Because I'm hearing the uptick, I'm not hearing why you think the reason is. Vijay Pandey here says the UN chief Antonio Guterres has expressed concern over the deaths of 2 journalists in India and also violence against media persons across the globe. Aditi, can you unpack this reason? Why is this happening right now in India?
You see, Femi, after a long rule of the Congress-led United Progressive Alliance government in India, you know, a right-wing party, which is the BJP, came into power in the country in 2014. And, you know, we all know that the narrative ever since the BJP took over under the leadership of Prime Minister Narendra Modi has been bordering on nationalism. You know, of course, nationalism is an extremely sensitive topic. How media organizations deal with such a sensitive topic is a matter of concern. Hyper-nationalism has its own consequences. This kind of narrative has, you know, its own ramifications. In such a scenario where ideologies are clashing every now and again, it becomes the responsibility of the national media to restore that very significant balance in public narrative. This balance, the moment it turns left or the moment it turns right, there is a problem. You know, India, as you know, is suffering from left-wing extremism in a number of districts. Even today, the government is battling that. Then there is this right-wing, you know, narrative, which has actually come into play since the rise of the BJP. You know, there are all kinds of
so this is political. You feel this is coming from...
Not all of it.
Not all of it.
See, not all of it is political. But you have to understand that most of the violence against journalists in India does not come essentially from the central government. You see, India is a huge country with so many states. There are law makers who have vested interests in businesses, who have vested interests in big corporations. Then there are, you know, law enforcers who are always clashing with the media for one reason or the other. There was a recent study conducted by an independent watchdog called the Hoot in India, which actually analyzed the perpetrators of the crimes against journalists. And it was actually found that law enforcers and lawmakers are among the biggest perpetrators of violence against journalists in India. I again want to emphasize, Femi, this is not a new phenomenon, but yes, you know, it is more visible, it's more out there because ideologies are clashing openly. the right and the left. There's a lot of churn going on in India's social as well as political fabric, and this is a difficult time for the country.
Sure.
It's
Let me
a
just
time
bring
for
back.
every.
Let me just bring back Emmy. Thank you, ATT. Emmy, I want to show what you posted on your Facebook recently. This is March the 10th. I just want to warn people that these are really nasty bruises. How badly were you hurt, Emmy?
It was pretty bad. I was bruised all over my body. I have a severe injury on my butt, on my back shoulder, and on my back arms. So you can see that all the injuries I received were on my back while I was running away from the police. So despite me screaming media and despite me saying that I'm a journalist, they still attack me. This is all the while I was trying to get to the safe area.
See, Emmy,
So,
there's something.
apart from all the-
Let me bring this up with you here, because we're running out of time on the show, and I want to make sure that we get to this point. There's a story that the Quint published about you. They published your story, and they said you speak to your journalists in your country, Delhi journos. Where was the outrage when Assam police beat me up? Why did you ask that question?
Yeah. Well, I asked that because when I look at the coverage that I received, and also the same incident, a similar incident that happened, a few days later in Delhi, and when I look at those incidents, how it was covered, how it got coverage in the mainstream media, in all the television channels and all the print media, I can see that my stories were not highlighted as much as it was from the Delhi journalists who were who went through the same experience. I asked that question because I feel that I was ignored to a large part. If my stories would have get as much.
I don't care about you because you're covering the rural areas. If I could just interject there, because helping out with the phone line, which is really tricky right now. All right, so let me just make this very clear. Nivedita says to us, many in Delhi media are not bothered about and not even willing to know about the conditions in which journalists from the hinterlands work. Northeastern India faces neglect on many counts. Pradeep, I hear you. A senior media person calls it a tyranny of distance. What is this tyranny of distance?
Yeah. I'd like to talk
go ahead.
about it. Yeah. When the incident had happened with Annie for almost 10 days, there was absolutely no coverage. I guess the stream itself has picked up this subject because of what happened to the Hindustan Times journalist, photojournalist Anushri, when she was beaten up by the cops in Delhi. Till that time, almost 10 days had passed, and nobody had uttered a single word about what had happened with Emmy, and her injuries were much more grave. What had happened with the photojournalist here in Delhi, it was really bad. But we should have spoken about what had happened with Emmy. There was not even a single word of solidarity. No protest marches were taken out. But when the incident happened during the march of the JNU students, when the journalists were beaten up and allegedly molested by the cops, the action was swift by the journalists. They took out the protest. They were almost marching towards the Indian Parliament, and within few days you could see the action had been taken against the cops.
Just for
who were
our
responsible.
international viewers, JN University is a university near New Delhi.
And,
and Delhi police even here, they're tweeting about this. During the protests by JNU students, a section of the students became aggressive, tried to push down police barricades. Police had to resort to use of water cannon, and a few protesters had to be removed from the spot. But then they go on to say, in this situation, one female journalist has given a complaint of molestation, and the same will be inquired into by the Vigilance Branch for further action. So not denying it. Go ahead.
One more thing.
Go, please.
Also, unlike the Western countries, here in India, journalists are not really trained to report from conflict areas or conflict zones, or when they're covering protests and all. They hardly wear maybe a jacket or something, a vest, which clearly says they're press personnel or anything, In situations like this, and more so in the age of digital media, a lot of mobile journalism is happening. Sometimes it also, I'm not trying to defend the cops, sometimes it also gets very difficult for the police also to differentiate between the protesters and the journalists. But in Emmy's case, or also in the case of Anushri, the photojournalist from Hindustan Times in Delhi, who was allegedly beaten by the cops, of course they did tell the cops that they were journalists.
Let me just tell our audience how the police responded to you, Emmy. this quote here: "I was given information by the officers who were present on the spot. We all respect freedom of the press and the journalists." And this is from Adil Khan. He's a Deputy Commissioner of Assam's Hailakandi district. Emmy, what's going to happen to your case? You made the complaint. What are you expecting to happen?
Well, I'm still hoping for justice. I do believe that I will get my justice eventually, because I have the Media Journalists Association and also some of my friends and also some of the association, Women Journalists Association, that come forward and ask for an explanation, ask for justice on our behalf as well. And I do hope that we will get justice. Maybe I don't know when it will be, but I hope we will do get it in the future. And I hope the Hailakandi DC got suspended over this, because he was the one who ordered a firing order. He attacked us, and after he attacked the journalists on the first day, he made the same thing again to us. He attacked us again on the second day. So I think he is a culprit. And also the police, the Assam police, who beat me up after I said I'm a journalist. I do hope they got suspended over this.
All right. So Emmy is sitting there. Emmy is sitting there hoping. Well. Aditi, what practical advice are you giving your members about? Should they be preparing? Do they need training? Do they need combat training to be going out and reporting? What's the practical advice that you leave us with?
See,
well,
Femi,
hold tight a minute. Let me just check in.
At least some jacket that says the press, because
like a big press jacket that says press on the front, so that they know.
Yeah, at least some jacket, and also we need to. I think even the police need to be sensitized about this, about the press. I think the police who attacked me didn't know, or I don't know if they're literate enough to understand press or not. But I do. I think it's important that even the police got sensitized over the freedom of the press, and also we journalists need to be prepared that when we go to this area, anything can happen. And like in my case, I used to wonder if I would have wore a jacket that said press, really big printed on the front. Perhaps it would make a difference.
I mean, in a sentence, because I just want to go to Tradeep just before we wrap up. In a sentence, knowing what you know, would you go out again?
Yes, of course, I would go again. It's my job. I love this job, and I think I would go anytime again.
All right, Tradeep, we're right at the end of the show.
Yeah.
What did you want to add?
So I'd like to say a small thing. What has happened with Emmy is symbolic of what is happening to thousands of journalists working in small towns of India and rural India. These journalists are primarily stringers. They don't belong to one particular organization. They are out there in the field filing stories. They collect stories. They give it to media outlets, and they are almost paid pittance. They are not employed to any media organization. So God forbid if anything happens to one of these kind of journalists who is a stringer, who hardly gets paid maybe 2,000 rupees for a story. There is no insurance covering him. There is no life insurance. There is no health insurance if he gets injured on the field while doing his duty. If he is killed, there is no backup. There is no organization to support him because he doesn't belong to an organization. He's not on the payroll of any media organization. So it's important for us to protect those journalists,
I hear
who are out there.
I did ask Aditi for some practical advice. Aditi, I'm asking you for this advice in a sentence. Go ahead.
Yeah, Femi, we tend to put the entire blame for everything on the doors of the government. But what I want to point out here is that media managements also have an equal responsibility in ensuring press freedom. I do completely endorse the viewpoint of Tradeep that when we as journalists go out into conflict zones, for instance, I have covered a number of elections.
Aditi, leave us with what sentence. We're at the end of the show, so I don't have to cut you in half. Your sentence is what?
So all managements have to evolve a complete comprehensive insurance policy.
Complete insurance policy. Aditi, that is a very positive note to end on. Thank you to Emmy, to Tradeep, to Aditi, to Daniel. Look here on my laptop here from Tashak. This is so important. He says, as a student of journalism in India, it bothers me that members of the journalism fraternity often have to risk themselves to practice their profession. That is what is at stake. Conversation continues online always at #AJStream. Thanks for watching, everybody. See you next time.